please make Kochi Dye Shop. Now, why would I ever do something so foolish? I mean, that would take me weeks to make. You know, I'm busy fixing Nintendo's broken intellectual property. You know, protesting for our rights as gamers. Advancing industries that desperately need my support, okay? You can't expect me to just put all that stuff on hold to make some stupid miniature video game crap. Joke's on you, I'm a slave to my creative impulses, so let's build a miniature Kochi Dye Shop from Tears of the Kingdom, and we're making the entire inside too, but you'll have to stick around to see all that. Alright, onto the craft now. The first thing I did was draw out a template for all the walls, and we're going to be using a Nintendo Switch controller to cut out all the windows and doors. Unfortunately, this is Nintendo hardware we're talking about, so they lose their sharpness after one use. Luckily, we have old reliable, so I'll be switching to the X-Acto knife to cut out all the rest. Once we have the paper templates all cut out, I can transfer them to some dollar store foam board, which will be acting as the interior and exterior walls. At the top of the walls, I'm cutting some notches in there, so that will eventually hold up our ceiling beams, and although I can't use the controller as a knife anymore, I can absolutely use it as a blunt object to beat the foam into submission. Don't worry too much about the ethics of that, because now it's time to start carving into the foam so it looks like the stones on the outside of the dye shop. I'm starting with the corner and using a dull pencil to draw out all the stones. My main concern was accidentally poking through to the interior wall because that's smooth, so I had to be a bit careful when adding all this texture. I think keeping the foam flat on my work surface was the key, but who knows. I roughed up the edges of the stones and added some deeper cracks with a pencil and used some sculpting tools to press down some areas of the foam to create more depth. It is night and day between when I first draw on the stones and after I add all the detail. I really like how they look from above, and you can see the interior wall is perfectly undamaged. This means it's time to start painting all the stonework on the outside. Since this white paint is almost out, I'm gonna go full Italian grandma mode and mix in some water to get the rest of the paint out. That worked like an absolute charm, so I mixed up a nice gray and gave all the stones their first of many coats of paint. Now once the stones were all covered, I went back and detailed random stones in different shades of gray, both lighter and darker, so it wouldn't look so uniform. Once that was done, I gave all the stones a dark wash of just black acrylic paint and water. Now this makes the rock look like it's actually been through something, but to maintain a balance since we've brought out the darks, we likewise have to bring out some lights. To do that, I'm just going to dry brush on some white, and with that done, we can move on to painting the walls. Now the houses in Hateno have a very unique texture that I want to do right. Just like painting on the stones, there's a couple of layers we have to get through to make sure the walls look cool, the first and second one being a layer of gesso mixed with some paint. This is to give future layers something to grab onto and obviously to cover the foam. Alright, so the next layer is kind of hard to describe in like a proper sentence, so I came up with a math equation on how you could make your goop look like my goop. That's so gross sounding, oh my god. Gesso goop plus paint goop plus glue goop plus life goop times time equals my goop. That sounds so gross, but basically after I applied this layer, I let it dry for a bit, and when I would move it around with my paintbrush, it would kind of clump onto itself, and it ended up much like how I imagine the Hateno houses would look in real life. Here's some better footage of how the goop was acting after it dried a bit. This part was chef's kiss. Very satisfying. Then I applied a layer of darker beige paint over all the walls because I felt the color was a smidgen too light, and once all the walls had the right base color, I mixed up a yellow wash that would really bring out all the texture we made. Now after the yellow wash dried, it was looking quite good, about as good as a wall can possibly look, and the last thing to do before you can begin assembling these foam pieces into an actual house is to dry brush on a much lighter beige to bring out all the high points of the wall. Once that was done to the inside and outside of the walls, I used some glue and painter's tape to connect all of them together. Now for the floor, I'm starting with some more dollar store foam board, cutting it to size and ripping off the paper layer before gluing it to the rest of the house. While we let the glue dry, I'm taking a metric ass ton of popsicle sticks and cutting off both rounded ends with this little snipper. This part in particular made me want to assume the fetal position and cry in a corner. Once I have enough made, I can start painting them brown, as well as painting the foam that will be underneath them brown to match. Now, I tried to be relatively accurate with how the floorboards were installed in the dye shop, so the first row of them took the longest just because I wanted to get all of their lengths correct, but this paid off because after the first row, the rest of the planks looked like they were in the same position as they are in the game. That being said, I did end up painting over the browns I initially used for these planks. They just looked weird and not the same, so I painted over them in a darker brown and it looked a lot better. And with the main floor laid down, it's time to build the most integral part of the dye shop, which are the baths. Possibly my favorite part of the build, just because this is where Link is unceremoniously dumped into a vat of dye. Iconic. And the first thing I'm going to do to make this area is section off the two chambers where the vats are with some foam to act as the walls, and cut a large circle out of some foam to make room for the buckets of dye. Now once I have two of those cut out, I glue everything down and use some paint bottles to weigh down the foam a bit, as well as make a huge mess everywhere. And once the glue is dry, we can work on making it look like not foam. Since the inside of these looks like concrete, I'm going to paint over the foam a couple times with a light gray. I'm going to put some protection over the hardwood floors because now that I have a good amount of coverage, I'm going to stipple on the same color with one of those super cheap brushes. I don't know what they're called, but they feel like hay and they suck for every other artistic purpose I have ever used them for. But they get to live another day because after a couple layers, it has that really nice bumpy concrete look to it, and to accentuate that, I did a dark wash and a layer of dry brushing. Next comes the tiles in front of the baths, and I'm starting with some craft foam. Don't panic about the color, it'll all be covered by several layers of paint. I'm just using Mod Podge to glue down all the different sized rectangles and then covering all of them with a deep navy blue. Then I'm stippling on a couple different grays to make them look like weathered stones, and once all of those layers have dried, I can remove the painter's tape and add the final details to the bottom floor hardwood. I added 3 half planks that jut into the stone and used some painted sketchbook paper to act as the dark brown trim that connects the hardwood to the tile. With the area all ready, it's time to start gluing some painted planks around the circumference of the bath. Now for the front part of the bath, instead of coffee stir sticks, I used cut up toothpicks. Now to hide all the jagged tops of the wood, because I'm far too lazy to just measure out all of them properly, I'm using sketchbook paper and more craft foam that I paint to blend into the bath. After I paint the bottom of the bath, I cut out a bunch more foam and painted black. These pieces will act as the border for the baths, and I just use some Mod Podge to secure them to the rest of the craft. The top of the border that connects to the second floor is made partially of wood, so I glued down more tiny coffee stir sticks in the middle of a piece of foam. With that on, we can finally begin construction on the second floor. Woo! I'm gonna start by making the 2 trapdoors above the baths. I used jumbo and regular popsicle sticks and used super glue to fuse them together. Around all of them, I added a sketchbook paper border, and then I could paint on the wood color and the arrows that show Link where to stand before he gets dunked like a donut into a pool of dye. Now, the second floor of the dye shop has different widths for the planks. It would seem that this is some home carpentry that took place here. I outlined where the trapdoors would go and painted all of the planks, as well as cut out the area for the trapdoors. Now, before we can glue the second floor down, I had to keep in mind that it would probably be very hard to reach into the baths with the second floor secured, so I'm adding all the dye drops and smudges inside the baths, on the concrete that surrounds them, as well as on the tiles in front of them. We add many more way down the line, but this is just so I don't have to break my wrist trying to add them in later. Also, this is where I noticed my favorite detail in the building, bar none, which is that the left bath that Link uses is filled with super bright stains, and the bath on the right, which no one uses, is dusty and all the stains have faded significantly. To mimic this, all I did was water down the colors I was using on the left side, but I do very much appreciate that detail and I had to tell you about it. The last thing is to add some blue resin to both sides, and finally we can glue down our second floor. Now, in-game, both trapdoors are always closed until you actually decide to dye your armor, but to piggyback off my favorite detail, I glued the left trapdoor in an open position and the right trapdoor in a closed position. A second floor isn't of much use if there's no way to get up there, so we can finally cover that blue craft foam that is a total eyesore with a staircase. Once all the stairs were on, I added the last few planks and painted them the same color as the rest of the second floor. We have mastered the second floor, so now it's time to tackle the roof. This part was surprisingly easy. The first thing I did was glue some foam together, and these will be our ceiling beams. I cut it at the same angle as the wall, and instead of gluing them down, since we want the roof to be removable, I used some painter's tape to secure them in this position for the time being. Once all of our beams were secured, I started gluing down some vertical pieces of foam that would connect all of the main beams. Gluing them on both the inside and outside, while being careful to not glue them to the walls themselves, and also leaving room for the main walls would give us a sturdy frame to lift up and off the main building. Now that we have the bones, I'm using some poster paper that I cut just deep enough to create a few angles to seal off our dye shop from the outside elements. Now, this part was honestly unnecessary, but I did it anyway just because I wanted to be as accurate as I could. After I painted all the beams, I could have just left the sections between them as brown, since you would literally never see them again, but I wanted to be faithful to the model, so I trimmed a bunch of coffee stir sticks to fill up all the sections, and then painted them a lighter brown just like it is in the game. While we let that paint dry, it's time to add all the windows, and this was pretty simple. I cut up a plastic sheet to fit nice and snug in all the window holes, and once every window had a pane, I split and cut an ungodly amount of toothpicks to act as the border for these windows. I used Mod Podge to secure them to the rest of the model, and I made sure to touch up any raw toothpick parts that you could see with paint. Now, the two larger windows had a bit more detail, so I used coffee stir sticks and toothpicks to divide them like they are in the game, and then used some jumbo popsicle sticks to make the blue shutters. The shutters have 4 nails in the horizontal part, so I mixed up some gunmetal gray paint with Mod Podge and dabbed on the nails with a toothpick. Then I cut and painted some craft foam to act as the stone outline around the windows before I glued on the shutters. And would you look at that, we got windows, we got a roof, and I'm very excited to work on the roof tiles, but we do have one more step to work on before we can add all the fun, whimsical roof tiles, and that is the giant chimney sticking out of the house. Now, the houses in Hateno have quite funky chimneys, they're very oddly shaped, and on top of that, we want ours to be removable. I'm basically working section by section and gluing the foam to itself, making sure that it can hug the side of the roof to stay in place. I don't want to glue the chimney down to the roof, only because when we take the roof off, it would make it very hard to put the roof down safely. It would probably have to sit at a really weird angle, and I don't want to take any chances damaging it. But after I carved off all the hard edges, I detailed the chimney with the same process I used to detail all the other walls of the house. At the top of the chimney are 4 pillars, a baby roof, and a couple of wooden details, so I paint more foam and glue it down in place. With all of the yellowish beige wall parts in place, I use a yellow wash and dry brush everything just like I did with the rest of the house. With the chimney complete, it is time to resume the fetal position once more as I cut 800 million shingles from a few packs of large popsicle sticks. If you were curious about how much space all the popsicle sticks I cut up for the roof took up, it was 2 Gatorade bottles worth of shingles. For more diversity in the shingles so they weren't all the same size, because that's boring, I dumped about half of them out and sliced them in twain. Then I began my journey of applying copious amounts of Mod Podge to the top of the roof and adding rows and rows and rows of shingles. Honestly, if I could go back, I think I would only use super glue for this part because the roof ended up warping just a tiny bit, and I think it's because I used so much Mod Podge in the pursuit of making sure that everything was stable. But on the bright side of things getting a little wonky is that the roof tiles got a bit wonky, just in a very cute way. For the end caps of the last row, I did those separately and glued them down. After waiting a long time for all that Mod Podge to dry, I could start painting, and just like everything else in this build, we're going to be layering a bunch of paints to get a proper amount of detail in. The first step is to paint all of the shingles in a watery orange, and I want to water down the paints enough that you still get to see a fair amount of that wood grain. After making sure every part of the roof got a good coat, I'm watering down some red to paint on random shingles. Then comes the first of many dry brush layers. This one we're giving the entire roof a dry brush of brown. Obviously Hateno Village has been around for a while, so the roof shouldn't look pristinely new and clean. Then I'm going in with a yellow dry brush to bring back oh my gosh! Then I'm going in with a yellow dry brush to bring back a little color. After I remember how to read properly, I do a final dry brush of white over all the shingles to make the roof look a bit more weathered. With that final layer, the roof is done and we can take it off along with the chimney to start working on the inside, which I had an absolute blast doing. But before we start working on any tiny furniture, there's one part of the house left that we should add first, and that is the fireplace on the inside. We're gonna make the fireplace first because it's connected to the rest of the wall, so the first thing I do is carve in all the stone to it with my pencil and sculpting tools. I add the top parts with Mod Podge and more foam, and then paint the stones and wall in the same way I did the rest of the building. Now, the fireplace cover is quite unique. It's made up of several colorful wood panels with the Dye Shop logo painted on. So I cut up some popsicle sticks and started painting them in their respective colors, as well as painting on the patterns and the logo. With the outside of the fireplace and the inside panels ready to go, I used some super glue to attach them to the back. Once they were secure, I added a little panel with a handle made out of bent wire to the bottom and secured it to the rest of the house. And now we can start the absurdly adorable process of filling this dye shop with all the furniture and knickknacks that the Zelda dev team lovingly placed into the game. We're starting with a single bed and bunk bed, so I'll be using hot glue, foam board, and craft foam to make the bed frames. Once I paint the first one, I had to think about how I was going to proceed making all the fabric items, and that's when I found some felt, and it felt as if the craft god smiled upon me. So I used some of it to cover a piece of foam to make the mattress, and then I used some watery paint to color it. I glued down the comforter and colored that as well before painting on the designs. I do the same thing once more for the bunk beds, only I make a little foam ladder to go with them. Now between these two bed sets is a nightstand, so I begin by gluing some jumbo popsicle sticks to each other to make a frame. Then I take a piece of foam and use my pencil to add in some wood grain before painting both of them. Now this drawer has a wooden stick going down the middle, so I paint a sliver of a coffee stir stick and glue it onto the green drawer. After pressing it into the frame, I can add the hinges and a handle with black construction paper and a tiny piece of wood. Next up comes the very long display table you see when you first enter the dye shop. I use a mixture of foam and wood to get the general shape of the table before indenting wood grain into the foam with my pencil. The display table gets a coat of very dark brown, and then I can make the two floating shelves that are just painted popsicle sticks and pieces of foam. Now when all those pieces dry, we now have a very good chunk of furniture done, so I'm going to use some super glue to secure all of them to the inside of the model. With the bunk bed in place, I can glue down the main desk, which are just 3 popsicle sticks, and the shelves above it. I use some toothpicks and textured foam board to construct a tiny little chair for the desk and painted it to match. Next up for our furniture lineup is this long dresser at the top of the stairs and this shelf located right next to it. After I paint both of them, we can start worrying about all the knickknacks that go inside them, the first being a lot of folded fabric. Because these models are so tiny, I had to experiment with the size of these fabrics, but it didn't take long to get them to the right size and secured in the dresser. Up next, I cut up some more popsicle sticks into minuscule pieces and used super glue to attach them to each other. These are 2 trays that hold sewing materials and clamps, and next to these trays is a tiny box with 2 drawers, so I used tiny foam cubes, textured them to look like wood, and cut off the end of a toothpick to act as the knobs. I made another tray out of coffee stir sticks and a tiny box out of more foam and wood. Now after I put them in their rightful place, it's time to branch out for a very important component of this build. You see, the dye shop has an infinite amount of glasses and potions and dye bottles, etc. And I had to think of a few ways to make things that look like tiny bottles, until eventually I started thinking of beads. I'll be using several beads, including these clear perler beads. See, when you paint the inside, it looks like a glass filled with a colorful substance of some sort. And to top these off, I glue on some gold bead toppers. I think these look super cute, and eventually we'll add tiny labels to the many others that I end up making, but with that we filled the bottom part, so it's time to start adding all the components above them. Underneath the first tray is a yellow placemat, and underneath the tiny drawers is a green one. Then I add the trays, but those aren't complete until we make all the tiny things that go inside them. See, a while ago I got into embroidering, so I have a bunch of extra embroidery thread, and I thought, what better way to make tiny spools of thread than to use actual thread? I used some super glue to wrap the thread around cut toothpicks, and oh my god, these are probably the cutest thing I will ever make. Now this is just the pink one, but I made several more colors of these spools, at least as many as I could fit into the tray. To make the clips in the tray next to these, I cut toothpicks at an angle, glued them together, and painted them a dark brown. And with that done, I can use more super glue to secure all of these cuties to their respective trays. I made a coiled up measuring tape with a thin piece of sketchbook paper, and I used an X-Acto knife to press on those super thin black lines. Then for the tray on the far left, it has a bunch of rolls of fabric, so I used some brown embroidery thread as rope and tied them all in the middle. Now I definitely didn't lose the footage of me adding all the knickknacks to that particular shelf. But anyway, I glued both of those completed pieces to their place in the model, and now we can move on to another batch of furniture. The next thing we're making is the small table on the first floor, so I glued toothpicks and coffee stir sticks to a jumbo popsicle stick and painted it all brown. Next up is the dresser filled and topped with fabric on the other end of the second floor. After I make the frame, I use a piece of sketchbook paper to close up the back and paint it all brown. Once the paint dries, I can add all the little fabric details. Off camera, I cut up a bunch more coffee stir sticks and glued them around little foam discs to make buckets. After I paint them, I'll add the black rings with some construction paper, and these will be placed all around the model. Now before we can finish gluing down this batch of furniture, I can't forget the little coat hanger on the wall right next to the bath, so I scored a popsicle stick to make it look more weathered, and used some cut up toothpicks as the knobs. Up next, I'm gluing down the shelves and racks on the second floor. Now this is a bit of a pivot, but I have a squirrel brain, so we're going to be putting down all the fabric samples on the first floor display table and the shelves above it. With those secured, it's time to go even smaller. We're starting with all the stuff on the nightstand. They have a white placemat under all of this, so I'm using some painted scrap fabric for that. And on top of that placemat, they have a tea set, so a small sugar jar, a long wooden bead I cut and painted to be a vase with some spoons glued into it, a tea kettle also made out of beads, and tiny teacups made of foam and wire for the handles. Up next on the chopping block is the shelf above the single bed. On the shelf there's a decorative plate, so for that I covered the holes of a button and painted it to look like fine china. Now next to it is a bottle, and this is a tactic you will see many more times throughout this video, but I found these plastic droppers and I realized if you cut them, you can make a bunch of bottles. Much like the perler beads, the ability to paint the inside of them but keep that shiny plastic on the outside really makes the bottles look great. And you can decorate the outside any way you like. For this one, I just used orange painted sketchbook paper. Moving on to the table at the front entrance, this has a very big bowl where they look like they're grinding purple rupees to make dye, which is quite cool. So I cut up this aluminum bottle topper, I painted it brown, and filled it up with some resin. Before I cured the resin, I made a tiny wooden spoon with a stir stick, and I made a purple rupee out of a cut up popsicle stick. With some more of the scrap fabric that I used to make the placemat on the nightstand, I painted little doormats that are at the front of the baths, as well as the white tarps that are in front of the fireplace. I made another perler bottle and a jar using a painted button and bead as the top, and then I realized I was going to need many more perler bottles, so I painted a bunch of them and glued on some yellowed sketchbook paper as the labels. For this next tiny decoration, I'm sure there would have been a better way to do this, but my brain was kind of fried at this point in the craft. So around the dye shop is a bunch of hanging lavender, so I dabbed on dots of hot glue to the end of a toothpick and painted it in a few layers of purple. I cut the toothpick off at the end and used some of that yellow sketchbook paper as the wrapping around it. Finally, before I glued it to the model, I used some brown embroidery thread as the tie for the wrapping. The shelves on the second floor have a bunch of stuff going on. This one has an extra tiny bucket I made with toothpicks and some fabric right next to it. I used the long part of a dropper as the body of this jar with a button and bead as the top of it. To make all the bottles look different and unique, I cut all the droppers at different lengths, and these have some embroidery thread for extra pizzazz. I glued up some rolls of paper as well that I stacked onto each other, and although this isn't in the model in the game, I ended up making too many lavender bunches, so I ended up gluing these two to the side of this shelf. I made some burlap sacks with hot glue and felt and tied them off with some embroidery thread. Now at this point, all of these tiny creations have been child's play up until this point, because now we're working on all the stuff that Sage, the owner of the dye shop, has on his desk. Sage has this Walter White-ass setup, so I'm using different sized beads and connecting them with the skinny part of the droppers I've been using. Don't these toothpicks look like little table legs? You better agree, because I glued 4 of them to a tiny strip of a dropper, painted them dark brown, and I'm using that as the base for the big bead. Sage also has a little test tube set up, so I'm using the skinniest tip of the droppers as the test tubes and injecting some watered down paint into them. I glued down Walter White's setup, add a few books I made using sketchbook paper, and then decorate the shelves with an assortment of bottles and our test tubes. I also cut a microscopic square of parchment paper and graded some chalk pastel over a drop of Mod Podge on it to mimic the square of pigment he had on his desk. The last thing I did on his desk was glue a few bookmarks to the side of the open book pages. And since we're in the spirit of tiny pieces of paper, I also cut up a bunch more to use as the tags on his display fabrics. Then I'm gonna glue down more buckets and add a bunch of knickknacks to those as well. painted some fabric strips to hang on the iron rack under the second floor shelves, and I don't know how I forgot this, but I painted on the colorful triangles to the fireplace. Give yourselves a round of applause and a pat on the back because you just listened to some random craft lady on the internet talk about tiny knickknacks for 30 minutes. As a prize, here is footage of the exact moment I learned my Joy-Cons have officially passed on. But just because we have almost all of the inside done, we have virtually none of the outside done, so we're switching gears and working on the base. To make the base, I'm using XPS foam because it's nice and thick. I cut it to size, used a ball of foil to add some texture to the entire thing, and then gave it several coats of black paint and Mod Podge to seal it. To attach the dye shop, I slathered on a very nice coat of glue and let it sit until it dried. While it did, I used 2 pieces of XPS foam glued onto each other to start carving in all the stones for the little hill thing in front of the dye shop. Here's the before and after. All the details are carved onto the hill thing, and I glue that down to the rest of the base. While it's drying, I cut out the 2 storage areas underneath where the shed will go and used 2 pieces of dollar store foam board to add a bit of height to the area. Then I go over all these new additions with the same mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. But because I'm a fool, I forgot to glue on all the extra stones that are on the hill, so I glue those on and apply one more layer of black paint and Mod Podge. Then I paint some strips of foam to look like stone and glue them to the front entrance. There's more stone on the ground in front of the shop as well, so I add that with more foam board. Before we can add the static grass that I'm very excited about, we have to paint the base. I'm going to start with gray and be somewhat light-handed with the paint on the sides of the base as well as around all the stones. This way we can keep some of the black to act as our shadows. Once that dries, I'm going to go over everything with a black wash. And finally, before we can apply any static grass, I'm going to be painting all the areas that will be covered in green. So if there are any bald spots, it'll be much harder to see. Off camera, I made a watery mixture of the green paint I used for the base and Mod Podge. I'll be going over small sections at a time so the glue doesn't dry out, and surprisingly enough, as someone who has historically struggled with static grass, I don't know what stars aligned, what blades of grass aligned, but somehow it ended up looking really good. Any excess static grass I brushed off the model and put any excess I captured back into my stash. Next up on our to-do list, we have to build the shed that's behind the dye shop. I'll be using jumbo popsicle sticks that I painted and super glue to attach them to the model. Now, I'm not going to bother making the roof removable on the shed because it doesn't even have a door anymore, so you'll be able to catch a glimpse inside if you try. But if I remember correctly, in Breath of the Wild, all the sheds in Hateno had doors, you just couldn't open them, right? But luckily in Tears of the Kingdom, they let us look in the shed, so before I put the roof on, I will furnish it. So after painting the window cover, I made some open crates for more dropper wine bottles. And also, these are the droppers I've been using. They were super cheap, only took me 40 minutes to show you. I haven't seen anyone do this before, but knowing the internet, I guarantee someone has done it before me on Pinterest. I used some differently colored brown beads I got at the dollar store to act as the corks and glued them into their crates. I whipped up a quick wardrobe out of popsicle sticks and painted it to look like the one in the shed. Before gluing down the wardrobe and crates, I also added some shelves to the inside that I would put any excess bottles or knickknacks that ended up not making it into the main building, as well as some excess felt scraps. I added a border around the shed window and used some cheap wood sticks, I forgot what they're called, to make the ladder right next to the shed. Switching to the other side of the model, to the left of the front entrance is a little wooden cover that protects a chest of what seems to be hay, as well as a crate. To make the chest of hay, I used some yellow embroidery thread and just stuffed it in this popsicle stick crate I made with hot glue. Any excess I cut off, and I used some off-white thread to wrap around the crate and any extra wooden planks you see lying around. I used hot glue to secure all these goods into place, and while my glue gun was hot, I also filled... Wait, I said that weird. While my glue gun was warm, I also filled the storage area under the shed with any excess buckets and bead bottles. I made the ladder up to the roof, and while I was doing that, I made the overhang right next to it. After I installed shingles on that overhang, I installed shingles onto the shed. Before we paint those shingles though, I wanted to work on the roof deck, so I glued a bunch of coffee stir sticks to a square piece of foam board and cleaned up the sides with more stir sticks. I'm taking more of those sticks I didn't remember the name of and gluing them to the deck to work as the posts and railings. I painted the bottom of the deck before I glued it on because knowing me, I would accidentally ruin the roof tile paint job. Then I worked my way around adding any extra details and painting the rest of it. Next up on the chopping block is probably the most well-recognized part of the dye shop, and that is the big pergola outside the front entrance that supports the 4 giant bottles of dye. I glued on the legs and diagonal supports before adding the big sign support, or in this case, the big dye bottle support, above it. Once all the parts were secure, I painted it a dark brown. Now, while that was drying, I realized that the dye bottles are held together by what seems to be a leather strap. So I cut a piece of some faux leather that I already had lying around and stitched it up myself. I wanted it to look as close to the game as I could, but I'm not sure why I used so much thread. It took me like 8 years to pull all that string through, dear God. But luckily it was super simple, and at the end of it, I had a pretty dang cute strap. Now next is obviously the dye bottles, and I found these very adorable glass and cork containers for super cheap. Seeing these bottles on the shelf is actually what inspired me in the first place to make this building, so although they aren't more test tubey like they are in the game, I think they make a very good fit. To color the inside, I just poured the individual colors in and rotated the bottle, letting the paint do all the work for me until just enough of the inside was covered. While we let that paint dry as much as possible, it's time to work on all the fabric that's lying around outside. I painted the red scrap fabric I've been using a bit more maroon and used a light dry brush to really accentuate the fabric texture. I used my X-Acto knife to paint on any super thin straight lines because frankly my hands can barely bring a water bottle to my mouth properly. Then I used more white paint to draw on the patterns and logo. For the larger banner that's plastered right at the front of the building, I did take the time to write in actual Hylian, but for the smaller one, I just wrote gibberish. Then comes the giant banner hanging from the chimney. This part was kind of boring, so I didn't record it. I just glued wire inside the fabric so it'd have a bit more structure, wrapped it around the top of the chimney, and covered any exposed wire in twine. I painted on the symbol for that banner, and now we can start gluing down all these accessories. Off to the side, I also made these very cute hanging shield banners that hang off the pergola, and before I can show you more fabric shenanigans, we have to have the giant vats of dye outside the shop. Just kidding, you got pranked. I forgot that I still have to paint the extra shingles I added a while ago to the shed and the awning on the side hill. Phew, now that that's done, I can tell you how I made these giant vats. To make these, I just glued foam into a circle and then textured and painted them the same way I did the walls of the building. I'm going crazy. I added a foam bottom to them and connected that with hot glue. I painted them in their respective colors and then added a thin layer of resin. Onto more fabric shenanigans. I tried my best painting a few different fabrics the way they are in the game, or at least a somewhat simplified version, and I glued them to a quick stand that I'll be attaching to the roof. As well as above the vats of dye with some twine. Finally, with 2 popsicle sticks I glued together, I painted the front sign and glued it down. Then, wait. Before we move on to the last part of the video, I need to confess. I'm officially doing my first influencer apology. You see, in my last video, I made a grave error, okay? Every time I get a new patron, they get a verbal shout out in the next video. It sounds fun, right? The problem is that my brain is made of sand. And so that video, I completely forgot to give a proper shout out to Andrew H. So as penance, because I felt genuinely and incredibly guilty for this, I promised Andrew that he would become a permanent fixture in my next craft. I painted his profile picture from Patreon, and he has replaced the photo above the single bed. I think that this is an improvement anyway, because I couldn't even decipher what that photo was. So with that, the energy in the craft multiverse has gone back to normal, and I can finish this craft with peace of mind. Alright, I feel much better now, so we can move on to the final part of this craft that I had an unexpected amount of fun doing. I had a very old blank painting that I was never going to use, so I ripped the canvas off and cut out 6 miniature poster-sized pieces. I aged them with the yellow wash and started painting. You see, all around the shop are different posters with recipes for dyes of a few different colors, and it shows you all the ingredients you can find around Hyrule that'll help you dye your clothes that particular color. I'm not exactly the best at drawing 2D things. As I'm sure you can tell, I specialize more in 3D art. So to make these posters, I wanted to challenge myself to hand paint all of them instead of doing something like, for example, printing them out and gluing them to the wall. Eventually, I got into the groove and I would paint the bottles on first, so I had a starting point to sketch on all the other ingredients. Once I got all the bottles and blank labels painted on, I went through each poster, sketched out the general shape of all the ingredients, and then went through them, usually going from darkest colors to the lightest, or sometimes vice versa. Once all the ingredients were drawn on, I added all the scribbles next to them, the box next to the bottle itself, as well as at the top of the poster. After I did all of the posters, I grabbed some of these super tiny gold pins that I thought would work perfectly as the pins for these posters, so I stuck them through all 4 corners and chopped off any extra of the pin before gluing them to the wall. Now for every poster, they have a pin in each corner that secures them to the wall, except for the poster about black dye. Was this an oversight? A purposeful design choice for some reason? Are they trying to imply that Sage is as poor of a planner as I am? Because if so, relatable. Alright, that was just a small detail I had to laugh at, but with that, I'm gonna add a few last minute things, but I do believe you've earned the right to see these glamorous final shots of Kochi Dye Shop from Hateno Village. As always, but especially this time, since this video took me so long, I must say thank you to all of my supporters over on Patreon. My new DIYers, Meep, and Be Artsy, and Emma Granger, my new crafters, LW, and Thrawwin. By the way, he makes amazing ceramic videos, I'll link him in the description. And as always, my glorious new artificers, Andrew H. and Kara Martin. Now, I think I have the next video decided on, so I will give you one hint to try and figure out what I might be making while watching all of my other Zelda videos. There are 15 of me in Hyrule. On that note, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.